Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really plunging into the beginnings of modern economic thinking. We're doing a deep dive into Adam Smith's big one, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations.
hmm
We've pulled some key bits here from the first five books, the original 1776 text. And the mission really is to kind of cut through that historical language, uncover those foundational ideas Smith had about where wealth comes from, how we value things, what money and capital do, and also his pretty sharp critiques of the policies back then.
Yeah, it's fascinating going back to Smith in 1776
Yeah.
because you really see him building this whole framework based on just careful observation. It wasn't just abstract theory.
Yeah.
He's looking at pin factories, market towns, the whole colonial trade setup, trying to figure out the basic forces. He's definitely more than just the invisible hand catchphrase.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
where does he kick off this huge inquiry into wealth? He starts with something that sounds simple, but he says it's the absolute cornerstone, the division of labor.
Exactly. He sees specialization as this, incredible engine for progress. And it happens pretty naturally, he thinks. People figure out, hey, I'm good at this one thing.
Mm.
And they do it because they know, or they're pretty sure, they can trade their surplus,
Mm.
their extra pins, their extra grain,
Yeah.
for the other stuff they need, made by other specialists.
And he breaks down why this specialization makes everyone richer, right? It's more than just individual talent.
Oh, yeah, he has three main points on how it boosts productivity. Big time. First, just getting better at the task. Practice makes perfect, right?
Yep.
Increased dexterity. His famous pin factory example, one guy draws the wire, another straightens it.
Yeah.
They make way more pins together than if each person tried to do every single step.
Okay, dexterity. What else?
Second, saving time. Time you'd normally waste switching between different drapes or tools.
Makes sense.
And third, and this is crucial, it encourages inventing machines. Because when tasks get broken down and repetitive, it's easier to see, a machine could do that. He even says it increases the quantity of science, basically. All the practical knowledge and theoretical understanding society has.
And about invention. He has this really interesting idea about who actually comes up with the improvements. It's not always the person using the tool.
That's a great point he makes. Improvements come from the workers, sure, but also, significantly, from the people who make the machines, especially once that becomes its own specialized job. But he also throws in philosophers or men of speculation.
Right, the observers.
Yeah, people whose main job is just to watch everything, connect different ideas, maybe things that seem totally unrelated. They're the thinkers proposing completely new approaches.
So specialization sounds amazing, like universally good. But Smith immediately says, hold on, there are limits. Where does it not work so well?
The big one, the absolute key, he says, is the extent of the market. You can only specialize if you can actually sell your specialized product. In a tiny scattered population, he mentions remote parts of Scotland, one guy making only nails just can't find enough buyers.
Okay.
So the country workers, your carpenters, your smiths, they have to be generalists. They do lots of related things, making nails, maybe horseshoes, fixing plows, repairing carts, all because the local market isn't big enough for a separate specialist in each.
So the number of potential customers basically dictates how specialized you can get.
Exactly, and that's where transport comes in, especially water transport, rivers, coasts. They massively expand the potential market, open up the whole world, he says.
Right.
So specialization and all the improvements that come with it happen much earlier near water routes compared to inland areas stuck with smaller local markets. He points to the North American colonies, how they developed along the coasts and rivers first.
Okay, so if labor and specialization drive wealth, how does Smith measure it? How does he figure out what things actually cost? This gets us into price and value, which can be tricky.
Yeah, and he lays down a really foundational concept here. He argues the ultimate and real standard of value isn't money, it's labor.
Labor. How so?
The real price of anything, he says, is the actual toil and trouble it takes you to get it. Or maybe the amount of other people's labor you can command or buy if you trade it. Equal amounts of labor, he suggests, always cost the laborer the same sacrifice of their ease, their liberty, their happiness.
Okay.
What changes is how many goods that labor can buy at different times or places.
So money, then, is just a measuring stick. Convenience.
Precisely. Gold, silver, copper, that is just the nominal price, he calls it. It's the tool we use for exchange. But the real underlying cost, that's the labor involved. And then he makes another key point. The price of pretty much anything, in a developed economy anyway, breaks down into three core parts.
Right, the components of price.
Wages for the labor, profit for the capital used, and rent for the land or resource. These three, he says, are the original sources of all revenue in society.
Though he does say they can get kind of mixed up sometimes.
Yeah, especially in earlier or simpler societies. Think of a small farmer. After paying rent, what's left might look like profit. But really, it includes the return on his investment in tools and seed, that's true profit, plus payment for his own work, managing the farm and doing the labor. Those are wages. They're sort of jumbled together.
And the prices we actually see in the market, they aren't fixed, are they? He talks about market price versus natural price.
Yeah, think of the natural price as the baseline, is what it costs to produce something, covering the normal wages, profit, and rent. The natural rates.
Okay.
The market price is what you actually pay day to day, and that bounces around based on supply and demand. Lots of demand, not much supply. Market price goes above the natural price.
The opposite if there's a glut.
Exactly. Low demand, tons of supply, the market price falls below the natural price.
And he argues this up and down isn't chaos, it's how the market kind of corrects itself.
That's the idea. If the market price is high, profits are good. That attracts more people, more capital into making that thing. Supply goes up, price comes back down towards the natural level.
And if the price is too low,
people leave that business, resources go elsewhere, supply shrinks, and the price gets pulled back up.
Yeah.
It's like this constant gravitational pull towards that natural cost of production. That's what regulates things.
and this helps explain why some prices seem way more volatile than others.
It does. He compares, say, corn prices to linen or wool cloth prices. Farm output, how much corn gets to market, varies wildly. Weather, harvests, it's unpredictable.
Right.
Manufactured goods. Production is usually more stable, more controlled. So corn prices tend to jump around a lot more because of these supply shocks, on top of any changes in demand.
Let's dig into those three revenue sources he mentioned. What about rent? He had a striking phrase for it. A monopoly price.
That's a really sharp insight from Smith. He's basically saying rent isn't just tied to what the landlord spent improving the land. It's more about what the market allows. It's determined by how much the farmer can afford to pay, based on the demand for the produce and the price it fetches.
So it's not directly linked to cost.
Less directly than wages or profit, he thinks. If the price of, say, corn is high enough to cover the farmer's costs, his own labor, his normal profit, then whatever surplus is left over goes to the landlord as rent. If there's no surplus after covering those costs, no rent.
So the landowner is kind of capturing the extra value that comes from the land's fertility or its location or just high demand for what it grows, like a monopolist charging what the market will bear.
That's pretty much his view. He sees it as different from wages, which pay for labor, or profit, which is the return on invested capital. He gives examples like land growing some unique in-demand product, maybe fine fruits. That land can command really high rents, way more than the farming costs alone would justify. He also talks about mining. The most fertile mine in an area, say, the easiest coal to dig sets the price for everyone nearby. Less productive mines might struggle to make any profit or pay any rent because they have to match that low price. He even compares Cornish tin mines to Peruvian silver mines, suggesting rent made up a bigger slice of the price for tin than for silver from the richest mines.
Interesting. Okay, what about the second component, profit? How does he see that working?
Smith notices something here. Profits across different industries tend to be more level, more similar than wages for different types of jobs.
Really? Why is that?
Well, capital money invested in business tends to flow where the profits are highest. If one industry is making huge profits, more people invest in it, competition increases, and that drives profits back down towards the average rate.
So capital moves more freely than labor.
In a way, yes. Or at least the returns on capital tend to equalize more easily. He does say profit goes up with risk, but not always enough to compensate. He uses smuggling as an example. A successful smuggling run. Huge profit. But so many people are tempted by that potential high return that competition becomes fierce. Lots of people fail or get caught. So the average profit across all smugglers, considering the bankruptcies and losses, probably doesn't fully cover the immense risk involved.
That's fascinating. The lure of high profit creates its own downward pressure.
Exactly. And he contrasts this relative leveling of profit rates with the huge differences you see in wages. Think about a basic laborer versus, say, a highly skilled lawyer or doctor back then. Massive wage gap.
Right.
He also makes a really important point about prices. Rising profits push up the price of goods much more sharply than rising wages do, he puts it
Yeah.
starkly. Profits compound geometrically, wages arithmetically, meaning high profits inflate prices much faster.
He brings in some history, too, looking at price changes over long
Yeah,
periods.
he looks at wheat prices going back centuries, talks about how silver got cheaper after the Americas were discovered, more supply, then maybe got a bit more valuable again later. But crucially, he argues the real price of labor in Britain, in his time, had actually gone up.
Meaning workers could buy more stuff?
Yes. Their wages bought more goods.
Yeah.
And he says this wasn't just about silver's value changing. It was because Britain was doing well the peculiarly happy circumstances of the country. Basically, economic growth was increasing demand for labor, pushing up real wages.
Okay.
He notes things like cattle prices rising as a country develops, until it's just as profitable to use land for grazing or feed crops as it is for growing grain. He also points out how basic manufactured goods like simple clothing had gotten much cheaper in real terms over the centuries, while some foods, like meat, got more expensive. But he highlights potatoes. They become much cheaper, which was a huge help for the poor.
Right. So we've got labor, value, the price breakdown, market fluctuations. Now let's shift to the tools. Money, capital, investment. Smith has a bit of a different take on money itself.
He does. He calls it an expensive instrument of commerce.
Expensive.
Because maintaining that stock of gold and silver coins used as currency actually costs the nation something. Resources, labor. They're tied up in mining it, minting it, moving it around. That's effort not being used to produce other goods or services. So he sees the money supply itself as a kind of deduction from the nation's actual net revenue, its real wealth.
That directly challenges that whole mercantilist idea of hoarding gold and silver being the path to wealth.
Absolutely. He completely rejects the idea that a nation's wealth is just its pile of precious metals. He argues, look, when you export gold or silver, you're not losing wealth. You're exchanging it. You're getting foreign goods you can actually use or consume, or maybe you're using it to fund the carrying trade transporting goods between other foreign countries.
And that carrying trade does add wealth.
The profit from it does, yes. That profit adds to the nation's net revenue, in his view.
He also had some pretty sharp things to say about paper money and banking back then.
He was definitely cautious. He warned that too much paper money floating around is risky. If a bank issues way more notes than it has gold or silver to back them up,
Trouble.
yeah, those notes might come flooding back as people try to exchange them for metal. The bank could be forced to buy gold at a loss just to meet demand. He mentions the Bank of England having to do that sometimes. He gives a specific example. A Scottish bank that tried financing long-term land improvements by just printing more notes.
How'd that work out?
Badly. The notes kept coming right back to the bank demanding gold, basically draining the reserves because the investments wouldn't pay off for years.
And he saw a particular danger during wartime.
Yeah, if a country relies heavily on paper credit and an enemy captures the capital city and the treasury holding the reserves, that could cause a much bigger collapse than if the economy relied more on physical coin, which is more dispersed.
Makes sense.
He was especially harsh about banks issuing notes for tiny amounts like shillings or sixpence.
Why was that so bad?
He argued it allowed beggarly bankers, people without much real capital, to get into the business.
Yeah.
And when these inevitably went bankrupt, it caused chaos and hardship, especially for the poor, who were most likely to be holding those small notes.
Wow.
So for him, restricting small notes and making sure banks could always pay out gold or silver on demand were key ways to make banking safer for the public.
Shilling notes. Yeah, sounds like a disaster waiting to happen for ordinary folks.
Definitely precarious. Now, shifting to capital itself, the funds used for investment. Smith sees four main ways it gets used productively.
Okay, what are they?
First, getting raw materials, farming, mining, fishing, procuring rude produce, he calls it.
Real produce.
Yeah, it just means raw, unprocessed. Second, manufacturing, turning that raw stuff into finished goods. Third, transportation, moving goods wholesale, getting them to where they need to be sold. And fourth, retail trade, dividing those goods up and selling them directly to consumers.
And does he think some uses of capital are better than others for the nation?
Yes. Generally, he argues, capital used in domestic trade producing and selling goods within the country supports more productive labor and adds more to the country's annual output than capital used in foreign trade or the carrying trade. Forcing capital into those more distant, perhaps less naturally advantageous trades, maybe through government policy, he sees as inefficient for building national wealth.
He even ties how capital is used to the sort of character of a place.
It's a really interesting social observation he makes. He contrasts, say, busy mercantile towns, where capital is actively invested in industry and trade,
Right.
with what he calls court towns, where the main economic activity is just spending revenue, think government centers or places dominated by aristocratic estates. He suggests the first type breeds industriousness, while the second can lead to more idleness because people are supported by spending, not by employing capital productively.
And this connects directly to his famous arguments about saving versus spending, right? Frugality versus prodigality.
Absolutely central to his thinking on how wealth grows. The prodigal, the person who spends lavishly on consumption, actually diminishes the national pool of capital available for productive investment. They tend to employ unproductive labor, like lots of personal servants, whose work doesn't create a tangible product that adds to the national stock of goods.
Okay.
The frugal person, on the other hand, saves. And those savings, Smith argues, almost always get put back into the system as capital. That capital then employs productive labor workers making things which increases the total annual output and wealth of the country.
So saving isn't just good for you personally. It's actually building the nation's wealth.
That's his core argument. It's how the productive capacity grows.
Yeah.
He also notes that when people lend money out at interest, it's overwhelmingly borrowed by others who plan to invest it profitably. People who borrow just to spend tend to go broke quickly, and lenders learn not to lend to them.
Smart lenders.
Right. And on regulating interest rates, he had a specific idea. He thought the legal maximum rate should be set just slightly above the lowest market rate for prime borrowers.
Why slightly above?
To ensure that good, reliable borrowers could still get loans, but also to discourage people from borrowing purely for wasteful spending. If the rate was too low, it might either choke off lending altogether or push desperate borrowers towards illegal loan sharks charging exorbitant rates.
Okay, so all these economic mechanisms, labor, value, money, capital, they don't happen in a vacuum. They operate within laws, policies, customs. And Smith spends a lot of time criticizing the policies he saw in Europe, arguing they often got in the way.
He's very critical of what he terms the policy of Europe. He argues it constantly created more inequality and inefficiency than you'd get if you just left things to perfect liberty. He sees policies always messing with the natural flow of labor and capital. Either they restrict competition somewhere, or they artificially boost it somewhere else, or they just block people or money from moving freely.
Like the old guild systems, those craft corporations.
Prime example. He saw those corporations and their restrictive rules as being deliberately designed to limit competition. By controlling who could practice a trade, or where, they kept prices, wages, and profits artificially high in the pounds. This gave town merchants and artisans an unfair advantage over people in the countryside, the farmers, the laborers. It broke down what he saw as a natural equality in exchange.
He had that funny example about coachmakers and wheelwrights.
Yeah, it highlights the absurdity. An old law, interpreted weirdly, meant a coachmaker wasn't allowed to make wheels because wheelmaking was an older established trade with its own rules. But a wheelwright could make coaches because coachmaking was newer and hadn't been locked down by the same restrictions.
Yes.
And he points out that some of the most successful manufacturing towns then, like Manchester and Birmingham, were actually thriving because they were relatively new and hadn't been subjected to these old guild restrictions when they were first passed.
So these rules weren't really about quality control, in his view, more about protecting insiders.
Largely, yes, that was Smith's take. He also slams the poor laws, specifically a statute from the reign of James II. It made it really hard for laborers to move from one parish to another to find work unless they met really strict conditions about settlement.
Why was that bad?
It basically trapped workers where they might not be needed and stopped them moving to places where jobs were available and they could be more productive. It caused hardship and just gummed up the whole economic system, preventing resources, in this case, labor, from flowing naturally.
A really big target for his criticism was the whole system known as mercantilism.
Oh, absolutely. He viewed this system as being pushed primarily by merchants and manufacturers, using what he called their sophistry, basically clever but misleading arguments.
For their own benefit.
Exactly. Their main goal, as he saw it, was to get the government to give them a monopoly in the home market, keep out foreign competition using high tariffs or outright bans on imports. He mentions restrictions on cattle, corn, wool cloth, silk.
And he just didn't buy the idea that governments are good at directing the economy.
Not at all. He thought it was incredibly presumptuous and dangerous. for any statesman or government body to think they knew better than individuals how best to employ capital and labor. Individuals risking their own money on the ground, they're the best judges, he argued. Government interference was more likely to mess things up than help.
What about something like the Act of Navigation, the policy that favored British ships for trade? Even he saw some merit in that, didn't he?
He makes a very careful distinction there. He says, look, from a defense perspective, maybe it's wise. National security, he argues, is of much more importance than opulence. So maybe as a military policy, it makes sense to ensure you have enough ships and sailors.
But not for wealth.
No. For opulence, for maximizing national wealth, he thought it was bad policy. A nation, like any individual, gets rich by buying low and selling high. Restricting imports, like the Act did, means it harder to export, too. Because if foreign ships can't bring goods in easily, they have less incentive to come out carrying your goods. So it reduces overall trade, forces you to buy imports dearer and sell exports cheaper than you could in a free market. Ultimately, less industry, less enjoyment, less wealth.
He also talked about the way countries would retaliate against each other with tariffs.
Yes, trade wars, basically.
Yeah, right.
One country puts up barriers, the other responds in kind. He mentions tariffs under Colbert in France leading to Dutch bans, and similar tit-for-tat restrictions between France and England. He suggests these policies often ended up hurting the countries that imposed them and were usually driven by those same merchant interests looking for monopoly advantages, not the general good.
And the whole focus back then on the balance of trade, trying to export more value than you import to get gold. What did Smith think of that?
He thought it was completely misguided. A false target. The real measure of whether a nation is getting richer or poorer, he argued, is the balance of the annual produce and consumption.
Meaning?
Basically, are you producing more goods and services each year than you're consuming? If your output exceeds your consumption, your capital grows, you invest more, you produce even more next year, you get richer. If you consume more than you produce, you're eating into your capital, your productive capacity shrinks, and you decline. It doesn't matter how much gold flows in or out. Gold is just the tool for exchange. The real wealth is the stuff you produce and can potentially consume or reinvest.
He was also really down on export bounties, government payments to encourage selling goods abroad.
Hated them.
Yeah.
He argued bounties basically forced trade into channels it wouldn't naturally go into, meaning less profitable channels overall.
Sure.
They essentially make the nation sell its goods abroad for less than they actually cost to produce. Otherwise, why would you need a subsidy to make the sale happen?
So it's inefficient.
Worse than that, he said, it imposes a double tax on the people, especially the corn bounty they had in England.
Double tax.
First, there's the actual tax money collected from everyone to pay the bounty to the exporters.
Okay, that's one.
Second, and usually much bigger, is the higher price everyone within the country has to pay for that same commodity. Because exporting it with a bounty reduces the supply available at home, driving up the domestic price. He calculated the corn bounty only affected about 131st of consumption being exported, but it significantly raised the price for the other 31sts eaten at home.
Ouch.
And he had that great example of the white herring fishery bounty. He claimed the bounty paid per ton of ship was so generous, people were basically outfitting ships just to claim the bounty, not because they could actually catch and sell the herring profitably.
Fishing for the subsidy, not the fish.
Pretty much. And his view on those old laws against middlemen in the grain trade, the engrossers, regraders, forestallers.
Yeah, what about them?
He thought those laws were totally absurd and counterproductive. Corn merchants, he argued, play a vital role. They buy grain from farmers when it's plentiful after harvest, store it, and sell it gradually through the year. This actually helps stabilize supply and prices. Laws against them just hurt farmers, forcing them to try and sell small amounts directly, tying up their time and capital. It also hindered investment in improving farmland.
So restricting them could actually make things worse.
Definitely. And restricting corn exports. While may be understandable in a tiny city-state facing starvation, in a large country like France or England, he argued it rarely prevented shortages, but did unfairly stop farmers from selling their product in the best market. He thought such bans could even turn a mere shortage, a dearth, into a full-blown famine by preventing grain from flowing to where it was most needed. Exports should only be stopped, if ever, at truly famine-level prices.
Okay, shifting gears completely now. Smith also looked closely at Europe's relationship with its colonies. What was his take there?
Well, his view on why they were set up in the first place was pretty cynical. Often just folly and injustice, he said, driven mainly by that unrealistic hunt for gold and silver, the whole El Dorado dream.
Right.
Though he did acknowledge that the actual people who went out and founded the colonies were often pretty enterprising and dynamic individuals.
And he had absolutely no time for the big, exclusive companies that governed some colonies, like the East India Company.
Oh, he rips into them. Calls them the worst of all governments for any country, whatever.
Well,
Brutal.
why so harsh?
He argued they inevitably oppressed the colonists. They had a monopoly, so they could force colonists to sell their produce cheap and buy European goods dear. And for the mother country, the company monopoly meant citizens back home also paid higher prices for colonial goods than they would in a competitive market. Plus, he saw these huge companies as inherently wasteful and prone to mismanagement because they weren't properly accountable. A monopoly held against your own nation by one of these companies. He thought that was particularly absurd.
Okay, so despite all that criticism, did Europe actually gain anything from discovering and colonizing the Americas?
Yes, overall, he thought Europe gained quite a lot. The discoveries and the resulting trade, even for countries that didn't have colonies themselves, massively increased the variety and quantity of goods circulating in Europe. New foods, new materials, spices. This availability boosted enjoyment and spurred European industry by creating much larger markets for its own manufactured goods.
But the specific advantage the mother country got that exclusive monopoly on its colonies trade, he wasn't convinced that was actually a net benefit.
Exactly. That was his controversial point. Yes, the monopoly forced certain colonial goods, the enumerated commodities, to be sent to Britain first. This might have made those raw materials a bit cheaper for British manufacturers, giving them an edge.
Sounds good so far.
But Smith argued the overall cost to the nation as a whole was greater than this limited benefit.
What was the cost then?
Well, first, the monopoly artificially pushed up the general rate of profit across the British economy, even in trades that had nothing to do with the colonies. And as we heard, he thought excessively high profits were bad. They inflated prices more than high wages did. Second, it forced Britain to buy colonial goods dearer and sell its own manufactured goods to the colonies dearer than they would in a free, competitive global market. This meant Britain traded less overall, bought less, sold less, enjoyed less, and produced less than it could have under free trade. It also diverted capital away from potentially more productive domestic industries into these distant, roundabout, and, he thought, more precarious colonial trades.
He even floated a really radical idea for the time, didn't he?
Yep.
About Britain's relationship with its American colonies.
He did. It was purely hypothetical, visionary even for 1776. He mused about whether Britain might actually be better off voluntarily giving up its colonies.
Why?
He argued it would save Britain the huge expense of governing and defending them. And maybe Britain could then negotiate a free trade agreement with the newly independent colonies that would be more beneficial to the average British person than the existing monopoly was. Less profit for the specific merchants benefiting from the monopoly, maybe, but better for the nation overall.
And politically.
He even speculated it might lead to warmer relations, a revival of natural affection, and strong alliances, sort of like how the ancient Greek city-states related to their independent colonies.
That is an incredible thought for just before the American Revolution. He also touched on the practical problems of ruling from afar, right? Especially taxing.
Yeah, briefly. He basically observed that it was probably impossible for London to effectively manage colonial assemblies to get them to vote for taxes sufficient to cover imperial costs. Comparing it to the difficulties the Crown already had getting money from the English Parliament, but made much harder by the distance and the lack of direct political control or patronage over colonial politicians.
Okay, so looking back at this huge sweep division of labor, value, rent, profit, capital, critiques of policy, colonies, what are the really big takeaways from diving into Smith's foundational ideas?
I think you see his core argument. Wealth comes from productive work, massively boosted by specialization, which is only limited by how big the market is. You get his perspective on labor as the real measure of value, with money just being a convenient, if costly, tool. You understand how he breaks price down into wages, profit, and rent, and how competition constantly pushes market prices towards those underlying natural costs. And there's this huge emphasis on building up capital through saving, through frugality, and investing it productively, preferably in domestic industry.
And maybe the most striking thing is that relentless critique of policies driven by narrow self-interest. The guilds, the mercantilist rules, the bounties, the colonial monopolies, all things, he argued, just distorted the economy, hurt the general public to benefit a few powerful groups, and ultimately held back the real growth of national wealth, which for him meant the total annual output of goods and services.
Exactly. It's a whole system he built based on observing how things actually worked, arguing that if you just let individuals pursue their own economic interests freely within a system of justice, that would naturally lead to a better allocation of resources and more prosperity for everyone than governments trying to micromanage things, especially when those governments are heavily influenced by special interests.
What really stands out to me listening again is how often he connects economic problems back to the influence of specific groups, especially merchants and manufacturers lobbying for privileges or monopolies that helped them but hurt everyone else and messed up the market's natural working.
That's a constant theme, isn't it? He's always asking, cui bono? Who benefits from this particular law or regulation? And does that benefit come at the expense of overall productivity or fair exchange between different sectors of society, like town versus country?
So the final thought then. Considering how critical Smith was of monopolies, of policies serving narrow interests over the public good, how do you think he might look at our world today? Some of the economic regulations we have, the global trade disputes, the sheer power and influence of some huge corporations on policy.
That really is the enduring question, isn't it? Would he see parallels today in modern lobbying, in trade protectionism for certain industries, maybe in market dominance of big tech or financial firms? His framework, his way of thinking, it gives you a powerful lens. It pushes you to look past the stated intentions of a policy and ask, is this really boosting the overall annual produce of the nation? Or is it maybe diverting capital inefficiently, stifling competition, and serving the sophistry, as he'd call it, of particular powerful groups?
Definitely a lot to chew on there. It shows the real value of going back and engaging directly with these foundational texts.
Absolutely. They still challenge us to think critically about the economic systems we live in.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the truly timeless insights of Adam Smith.